Wyoming Territory, September 1887. The wind kicked up dust across the Cheyenne depot, tugging at the hem of Delia Prescott's dress as she stood near the edge of the platform, clutching the single worn suitcase that held everything she had left. Her eyes brimmed over, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. She did not try to hide them anymore. Behind her, laughter rang out from a group of women in corseted dresses, their voices sharp as they whispered behind gloved hands. "Crying ain't going to bring him back," one of them said loud enough for Delia to hear. Another chimed in. Maybe if she'd been less weepy, he wouldn't have run off. Delia's face flushed, but she kept her eyes forward. She had no fire left to argue. Her fiancé had left her with a letter and a train ticket west, promising they'd start fresh in Salt Lake City. But he never showed. And now, with no family left, no money, and no place to go, she had stepped off the train in Cheyenne, hoping for anything. She did not expect the cowboy. Bootsteps approached slow. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. She glanced sideways as a tall man in a dusted coat and wide-brimmed hat came to stand beside her. He did not look at her at first, just took a seat on the bench nearby, long legs stretched out. "You waiting on someone?" he asked, voice low and rough like gravel softened by rain. Delia swallowed hard. "No," he nodded once. "Me neither." She said nothing. The laughter behind her faded as the women wandered off toward the hotel. The man leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I saw what they said to you," he said. "That was cruel." Delia stiffened. "It does not matter, I am used to it." "Well, that ain't right either." He looked at her then, eyes the color of a dark prairie storm. "You crying at a depot don't make you weak, just means you cared about something. That is not something to be ashamed of." Delia blinked fast. Her throat tightened. "You do not even know me," she said. He gave a slow nod. "That is true. But I reckon I know enough." She turned fully to him now, studying the tired lines around his mouth, the faint white scar just below his jaw, the way his hat sat low but did not hide the gentleness in his eyes. "What is your name?" she asked quietly. "Orrin Cade." She let the name settle in her mind. It felt sturdy somehow, reliable. "I am Delia Prescott," she said. "You got anyone in town?" She shook her head. "No, I was supposed to meet someone." He changed his mind. Orrin's jaw tightened just a little. "That makes him a fool." Delia looked down at her hands. She had small cuts on her palms from gripping her suitcase too tightly. "I do not know what to do now," she admitted. Orrin stood. "You hungry?" She blinked up at him. Yes." He reached for her suitcase without asking. It was heavier than it looked, but he lifted it like it weighed nothing. "Come on," he said. "There is a kitchen over at Mrs. Langley's boarding house. She does not turn away folks who need a warm meal." Delia hesitated, then followed. They walked down a wide dirt street lined with wooden storefronts and signs swinging in the breeze. She stayed quiet, but every few steps she glanced at him. He did not speak unless she did. He just walked beside her like it was the most natural thing in the world. Inside the boarding house, the smell of fresh bread and roast meat filled the air. Mrs. Langley gave Orrin a long look, then nodded. "Back again already?" she asked. He smiled a little. "Just passing through." Mrs. Langley's gaze slid to Delia. "Well, you found someone prettier than a stray dog this time." Delia flushed, but Orrin's voice was calm. "She is a guest. She will eat first." They sat at a small table near the window. Delia barely tasted the food, but the warmth of it settled something in her chest. When they finished, Orrin pushed his plate aside. "You got any place to sleep tonight?" he asked. She shook her head again. "You can stay here. I will pay for the room." "I cannot let you." "You can," he said gently. "And you will." Delia's lip trembled. "Why are you helping me?" Orrin looked at her for a long moment. "Because I know what it feels like to be left. And because you are enough, Delia, just as you are." The tears came again, but this time no one mocked her. Oren passed her a handkerchief and waited until she lifted her head again. "Tomorrow," he said, "I have to ride back out to my ranch. It is a few hours north. You could come with me. Work if you want to, rest if you need to." Delia stared at him, unsure if she had heard right. "You would take me with you," he nodded. "Only if you want to come. No pressure." She thought about the empty depot, the whispers, the letter in her pocket that no longer meant anything. Then she looked at Oren. "I will come," she said. He smiled, and it was the first time she saw something soft and quiet light up his face. "All right then," he said. "We leave at sunup." That night, Delia lay under a clean quilt in a small upstairs room, listening to the creak of the floorboards below as Oren moved through the house. She held his handkerchief to her chest and stared at the ceiling, for the first time in weeks not feeling alone. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew who would be beside her. The sun had only begun to tug at the edge of the world when Delia stepped onto the porch of Mrs. Langley's boarding house, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The air held the scent of sage and wood smoke, and the street still slept, save for a few grocers pulling open their shutters. Oren was already waiting beside a sorrel gelding and a stocky gray mule, both saddled and quiet. He held the reins loose in one hand, the other resting at his side. A bedroll and a small sack were tied behind his saddle, and Delia's suitcase had been secured behind the mule's pack. Nothing about his posture asked anything of her, but when she stepped toward him, he gave a short nod and offered her a hand to mount. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His palm was calloused, warm, and steady. "You ever ridden before?" he asked once she was seated. "Twice," she said. "Both times ended with bruises." "Well," Oren said, adjusting the reins, "we'll take it slow, mule'll follow. Just lean with the rise and don't fight the sway." They rode out at a gentle pace. The road north was packed dry from summer heat, flanked by cottonwoods and the odd clapboard fence. Past the edge of town, the land opened wide rolling hills, patched with grass gone brittle at the tips, and the occasional scatter of antelope in the distance. For a time, they rode in silence. It was Delia who spoke first. "Why do you live so far from town? Land's better out there. Soil holds after spring thaw and the cattle don't crowd each other. Suits me fine. You don't mind the quiet, I prefer it." She looked ahead again, watching a hawk tilt in the sky. "I used to think I'd live in a place with music," she said. "Not the parlor kind, real music, fiddles. People dancing. You like to dance?" "I used to, before everything got tangled." Oren didn't press. He adjusted his hat against the light. "There's a barn dance up near Fort Laramie every harvest moon," he offered after a while. "Folks from all around come. Bring their own chairs and pies." Delia glanced sideways. "Do you go?" "Sometimes. Usually just to trade news and sit out back." Her mouth tugged at the corner, not quite a smile. "You don't strike me as a wallflower." His voice was quiet, "Not much for crowds, but I stay the length. Makes a difference to folks, seeing you there." By midday, they reached a narrow creek lined with willow and flat stones. Oren swung down first, tying the reins to a low branch and loosening the mule's lead. Delia moved stiffly as she dismounted, but she didn't complain. Her legs ached with the unfamiliar movement and her hands felt raw from the reins. Oren handed her a tin cup filled from his canteen. "You're doing fine." She took the cup and sat on a nearby rock, dipping her fingers into the cool creek water. It stung pleasantly. "You live alone?" she asked. "Yeah." He pulled a small parcel of dried meat from his saddlebag and handed her a strip. "Had a brother once. Younger. Died of fever down in Nebraska when we were driving cattle. After that I came north to start fresh." Delia chewed slowly, the meat tough but salty. "I'm sorry." He folded his arms loosely over his knees. It was a long while ago. They didn't speak for a stretch. The wind shifted the leaves overhead, making the light dapple and move. Then Delia said, "I used to think if I loved someone hard enough, they wouldn't leave." Oren didn't look away. "That's not how it works. Sometimes it's got nothing to do with you," she nodded, but there was a tremor in it. "I still think maybe I wasn't enough." His voice came low. "You were." "You are," she blinked, eyes fixed on the water. "I don't know who I am out here," she said. "No one knows me. There's nothing familiar." "That can be a sorrow," Oren said, "or it can be freedom." When they rode again, the land grew rougher, low ridges rising like knuckles through the earth. A herd of black cattle grazed along the slope as they reached the crest of a hill, and beyond it, nestled against a stand of pine, sat a small ranch house with a slanted tin roof and smoke curling from the chimney. A barn stood to one side, weather gray, and a corral curved behind it. Delia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. There was no grandeur to it, just a quiet sort of welcome. Oren slowed the gelding and turned to her. "It's not much," he said, "but it's honest." She nodded. "It looks like it's waiting." He dismounted and came to help her down. This time, she didn't hesitate. Her boots hit the dirt and she stood beside him, breathing in the scent of pine and dry wood. Inside the house, the floor creaked underfoot. The front room held a plain table, a cold stove, and a shelf with worn books and a single fiddle leaning in the corner. Oren set her suitcase down near the door. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep in the loft." "I don't mind the floor," she said. He shook his head. "You've had enough hard ground." She glanced around, eyes catching on a woven rug beneath the table, frayed at the edges but clean. "You live quiet. I live simple." She stepped to the window, resting her fingers on the sill. "Would you teach me," she asked, "to live like this, to work the land, to ride better, to hold my own?" Oren didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Only if you don't expect to be perfect. You'll bruise again, maybe break a few things." She turned to face him. "I'd rather break something trying than sit and be nothing." He met her gaze with something steady in his own. "Then we start tomorrow." And for the first time in a long while, Delia felt the ground beneath her feet begin to feel like hers. The next morning began with frost silvering the grass, crisp underfoot, as Delia stepped into the yard. She pulled Oren's old wool coat tighter around her shoulders. It hung heavy and broad. The sleeves rolled at the cuffs, but it held in the warmth and smelled faintly of smoke and sun-dried cotton. Oren was already at the trough, sleeves pushed to his elbows, scraping ice from the rim with the back of a shovel. His breath curled in front of him, and when he looked up, his eyes crinkled at the corners. "Water's slow today," he said. "Creek's shallow this time of year. Gotta break it twice before noon." Delia nodded, then walked toward the barn. She didn't wait for instruction. The shovel leaned beside the door and she took it, dragging it through the frost-caked earth, clearing a path toward the pen. Her hands ached from the cold, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving until she could feel warmth building in her back. Oren joined her after a while, carrying a feed sack that sagged at the corners. "You don't have to prove anything," he said, voice even. "I'm not," she answered. "Just don't like standing still." They worked without chatter. By the time the sun cleared the hills, the animals had been fed, the trough thawed again, and the barn swept clean. Delia leaned against the stall wall, sweat cooling under her collar. Her braid had loosened, and strands clung to her neck. Oren poured water into a tin basin and passed it to her, then pulled a scrap of cloth from his pocket. "You're bleeding," he said, nodding at her knuckles. She looked down. The skin had split just beneath her fourth finger. She hadn't noticed. "I didn't feel it." "Cold'll do that," he said. "Let me see." She watched him kneel beside the bench. He didn't ask again, just waited. She sat slowly and laid her hand in his. His fingers were careful as he wrapped the cloth around her rough hands, sure hands, but gentle in the way they moved. My ma used to say broken skin meant you were learning something. Delia tilted her head. Did she teach you ranch work? No. She taught me how to mend shirts and treat blisters. My father taught me the rest. She let that settle. I don't remember my mother's voice, she said after a moment. I was 8 when she passed. I remember her hair, though. It always smelled like lilac water. Orrin didn't reply, but his thumb lingered just slightly against her wrist before he tied the cloth off. Later, inside the house, Delia stood at the stove turning cornbread in the skillet. Orrin sat near the window, oiling the leather straps of his saddle, the smell of saddle soap curling through the room. The silence between them had shifted, not absence but presence, not needing to fill every pause. You always cook for yourself? She asked, flipping the bread. Most times. Though it's a sorry thing to eat your own stew for 3 days straight. She set a plate before him and sat opposite. The cornbread was uneven, burnt at one edge, but he didn't mention it. He ate like someone who knew the weight of hard labor, steady, appreciative, without complaint. After the meal, they stepped outside again. The wind had softened, and the air carried the dry, copper tang of turning season. Orrin wiped his hands on his trousers and looked toward the hills. I've got fence posts to check along the south edge. Could use another pair of eyes for broken wire. Delia followed him to the edge of the paddock, where 2 horses stood saddled and waiting. He helped her mount, then handed her a worn pair of gloves. They'll help a little, he said. They rode side by side, the trail narrowing as it curved through a stand of poplar. Sunlight filtered through the thinning canopy, dappling their path in pale gold. Delia let the silence breathe for a while, then asked, "Why'd you build your home here?" He glanced toward the horizon. "The land's solid. Soil holds water just enough, and it's far enough out you can hear yourself think." She took that in, then looked at him sideways. "You think often," he chuckled, low and genuine. "Too much for a man who spends his days chasing cattle." They reached the first fence line, and Delia dismounted without waiting. She walked the length of wire, fingers trailing just above the top strand. A section near the end had come loose, the post leaning where the earth had eroded. She crouched beside it, pressing her boot against the base, testing the give. "You'll want to dig a new hole," she called. Orrin stepped beside her and offered a spade. "You catch on quick." "I was always better with my hands than my head." He didn't answer that, just watched as she worked the earth loose. When she stood, brushing dirt from her skirt, he took the post and drove it into the new hole. They moved down the line together, fixing what needed fixing. When the last post was set and the sun had begun to slip westward, they stood in the golden hush of late afternoon, breathing the scent of dust and pine. Delia leaned against the fence rail, arms crossed loosely. "I'm not sure what I am anymore. Not a bride. Not a daughter. Not the woman I was." Orrin didn't look away. "You don't need a title to be worth something," she swallowed, blinking against the light. "Sometimes I forget how to believe that." "I'll remind you," he said simply. She studied him, his worn collar, the dust at the knees of his trousers, the way the wind tugged at his hair where his hat rested against his leg. There was no pretense in him, no need to impress, just a man who'd seen enough to know what to hold on to. "I'd like that," she said. They rode back slow, evening folding over them like a quilt. When they reached the house, she lingered on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. Orrin came out after a while, 2 mugs in hand, steam rising. "Chamomile," he said. "Found some near the creek last spring." She took the mug, fingers brushing his. "Thank you." They sat side by side, not touching, not speaking for a long while. The quiet between them had weight now, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind that made space for breath. And when Delia turned to him, eyes soft in the starlight, Orrin met her gaze without flinching. Not everything needed to be said. Some things just needed to be witnessed. The next week brought the first true cold. The kind that settled in the bones, not just the skin. Delia learned quickly to wake before the frost stiffened the pump handle. She moved slower than Orrin, but she kept pace. Her sleeves rolled, skirt pinned up at the hem, hair braided tight to her scalp to keep it from her eyes. She asked fewer questions now and tried more things on her own. Sometimes she failed, but she never waited to be told twice. One evening, just past dusk, Orrin returned from the north pasture with a torn sleeve and a dried streak of blood down his forearm. Delia set down the sack of dried beans she'd been sorting and crossed the room. "What happened?" "Barbed wire caught me on the turn," he said, brushing it off. "Didn't see the fence in the dark." She took his arm without asking, guiding him to the table. She unwrapped the linen from the drawer, dipped it in the basin, and began to clean the cut. Her hands were steady, her mouth drawn in concentration. Orrin watched her work, his other hand resting on his knee. "You've done this before," he said. "My father was a cooper. He'd come home with splinters buried to the knuckle. My job was to keep the infection off." "Did you like that kind of work?" "Not especially," she said, dabbing at the wound. "But I liked the quiet. He'd never speak while I cleaned the cuts, but he'd stay still. It was the only time he ever seemed peaceful." She tied the cloth snugly, then sat back. "You won't be lifting anything heavy with that arm tomorrow." "Then I'll be lifting light things with the other," he replied. Delia gave a short laugh, then grew quiet again. She leaned on the table, watching the fire snap in the stove. "I found something in the barn loft," she said eventually. "A box of old papers, letters, some drawings. One of them had a boy's name on it. Wade Cade." Orrin's jaw moved slowly, but he didn't look away. "My brother," he said. "He used to draw horses with wings. Said he'd breed one someday, ride it over the Rockies, and never come back down. He sounded like he had a wild heart." "He did. Too wild for the trail we were on." Delia waited, but he didn't say more. She didn't press. Instead, she stood and crossed to the cabinet, pulling out the last of the dried apples they'd been saving. "We should use these before they go soft," she said. "There's still flour left. I could try a pie." "You don't have to. I want to." He nodded once, then rose and stoked the fire. She watched his back as he bent to tend the coals, the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, the quiet strength in the way he moved. Not rushed, not showy, just present. That night the pie crust was uneven and the apples slightly overcooked, but Orrin ate 2 slices without speaking. Delia watched him, legs curled beneath her on the worn settee, hands wrapped around a mug of chicory. "You don't talk much about the years before this place," she said. "Not much to say that's worth saying. There must be something." He set down his fork, wiped the corner of his mouth, and leaned back. "There was a woman once," he said. "Before the ranch, down near Julesburg. She liked the way I danced, thought I was quiet in a good way. We courted near a year. She married someone else while I was out driving cattle. Sent word after the ceremony." Delia's fingers tightened on the mug, but she said nothing. "I told myself I didn't mind, that it was better that way, but I stopped going to town dances after that." Delia looked into the fire. "I think we carry pieces of the people who leave us, even when we didn't ask to." He turned toward her, his voice low. "You don't seem afraid of being left anymore." "I still am," she said, "but I'm more afraid of never being known." The room was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, brushing the window panes with dry pine needles. "I see you, Delia," he said. She looked at him, slow and steady, the way she looked at the land when she was trying to understand it. "I believe you," she replied. He stood then, crossed to her, and offered his hand. She took it and he pulled her gently to her feet. They stood close, their hands between them. "There's no music," she said. "I remember the rhythm," he answered. They moved slow, barely more than a sway, but it was enough. The firelight flickered across the floorboards, their shadows dancing behind them. Delia closed her eyes, resting her cheek against his chest. His heartbeat was strong, sure. "Don't go quiet again," she whispered. "Not with me." "I won't," he said. The wind howled once outside, but inside the house there was only warmth and breath, and the soft step of two people learning to move in time. The days drew shorter, the wind colder. By the time the first snow dusted the ridge behind the barn, Delia had learned how to split kindling with a single strike, how to read shifting clouds across the western sky, and how to know when Orrin needed quiet and when he needed company, even if he never said so aloud. Late one afternoon, she stood on the ladder outside the chicken coop, hammering a loose shingle back into place. Orrin stepped out of the barn carrying a sack of oats over one shoulder. He paused when he saw her, shading his eyes with one hand. "You mean to fix the whole roof yourself?" he asked. "I'm just tired of the wind singing through the rafters every night," she said, checking the nails hold before climbing down. "Besides, I told you I wanted to learn how to take care of things. You're doing that, and then some." She brushed her hands off on her apron. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the land up near the creek. The slope's gentle and it holds sun most of the day." He set the sack down beside the feed bin. "What about it? I'd like to plant come spring. Not just for our table, I could sell what we don't keep. Potatoes, squash, maybe beans if the soil's deep enough." Orrin studied her, the corner of his mouth lifting. "You want to stay?" "I do," she said. "If you'll have me." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the yard, stopping in front of her. His gloves were stained, his coat worn at the seams, but nothing about him felt uncertain. "I've had this place longer than I've had anyone," he said. "I kept it quiet because I didn't think I'd find someone who fit here." Her voice was steady. "You did." He reached toward her then, not rushed, just sure, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You belong here, Delia. You always did. I just didn't know enough to hope for it." That night they shared a supper of roasted carrots and the last of the cured ham. After the dishes were dried, Delia stood by the hearth, holding a small wrapped bundle in her hands. "I made something," she said. Orrin looked up from the chair he was oiling. "For what?" "For you." She handed it to him, her fingers warm from the fire. Inside was a scarf, knit with coarse wool in even rows. The stitches were tight, the pattern simple. "You said you lost your last one during a cattle drive," she said. "Figured you wouldn't go out and get another." He ran his fingers over the weave, his eyes unreadable for a moment. Then he tucked the scarf into his lap and stood. "I didn't get you anything," he said, "but I did fix something." He walked to the corner where the fiddle leaned, lifted it carefully, and brought it to her. "You found the bridge," she said, surprised. "I carved a new one. Took me a while to get it right." She took it from him, her hands reverent. "I haven't played in years." "Then now's a good night to start." She tuned it slow, fingers steady. Then, with the fire low and snow starting to tap against the windows, she played. The sound was thin at first, then warmer as she found her rhythm. He sat across from her, one knee bent, eyes closed. When she finished, he stood, walked to her, and took her hands in his. "You make this house feel lived in," he said. "Not just pass through. I want to build something here. Not just plant in the ground, but roots. A life." He leaned in, his forehead against hers. "Then let's do that, together." They married 2 weeks later in the front room with pine boughs strung across the mantel and the snow thick outside. Mrs. Langley came up from Cheyenne, bringing a tin of molasses cookies and a hand-stitched quilt as a gift. The local parson rode in from Fort Laramie, his face red from the cold, his voice bright with cheer. Delia wore a blue wool dress she'd sewn herself, and Orrin had shaved for the first time in months. They stood before the fire, hands clasped, and spoke their vows without falter. No grand words, just promises made plain and true. Afterward, they shared a meal with the few neighbors who could make the ride. Laughter filled the house, and the fiddle came out again, its sound rising above the wind. That night, when the last lantern was doused and the house was quiet once more, Orrin and Delia lay beneath the quilt, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally, she whispered, "Do you believe in second chances?" He pressed a kiss to her hair. "No. I believe in the first one finding you late." In the spring, Delia planted her rows along the creek. Orrin built her a shed to store seed and tools. She sold her first harvest to a passing trader who laughed when she set her price, then paid it without argument. Orrin taught her how to shoe a horse, and she taught him how to bake bread that didn't turn to stone by morning. Every night they returned to the same home, the same roof, the same fire. Years passed, but the rhythm between them never wore thin. The land changed, as land does, but their life remained rooted. Not in the past, not in what they'd lost, but in what they'd chosen to build. And every fall, when the first frost came, Delia would wrap the old scarf around Orrin's neck, and he'd kiss her hand like he had that very first winter, wordless and sure. They had found their peace. Together.